In this Bible study, we are going to be looking at Matthew chapter 13 and verses 1 to 9. I'm going to be reading out of the Good News Bible or today's English version. Matthew chapter 13 and verse 1. That same day, Jesus left the house and went to the lakeside, where he sat down to teach. The crowds that gathered around him was so large that he got into a boat and sat in it while the crowd stood on the shore. He used parables to tell them many things. Once there was a man who went out to sow grain. As he scattered the seed in the field, some of it fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some of it fell on rocky ground where there was little soil. The seed soon sprouted because the soil wasn't deep. But when the sun came up, it burned the young plants, and because the roots had not grown deep enough, the plants soon dried up. Some of the seed fell among thorn bushes, which grew up and choked the plants. But some seed fell in good soil, and the plants bore grain. Some had 100 grains, others 60, and others 30. And Jesus concluded, listen then if you have ears. Here we have a snippet from the ministry of Jesus. Now, also note that on another level, we have the constructive work of Matthew in putting together his gospel. The Gospels are not just simply chronological accounts. Jesus did this, then Jesus did that, so on and so forth. They are attempts to tell the story of Jesus, but they're not just, a recitation of facts. They are trying to get at the core of who and what Jesus is. So as we pick up Matthew chapter 13, notice that this is a third of 5 blocks of teaching within Matthew's gospel. So one of the distinctions between Matthew's gospel and Mark and Luke is these large blocks of teaching that are interspersed into the narrative or story of Jesus. When we read this chapter, then, we need to see it from a literary perspective and not a historical perspective. And understand, to say this is not to say that what follows is a figment of Matthew's imagination. No, it is to say that there is a literary side to the writing of the Gospels, where you bring together the material from the life and teaching and ministry of Jesus and begin to put it in a constructive passage in a form so that people can read and understand what it is saying, what Jesus was about. So when we look at Matthew chapter 13, did Jesus teach at a lake? Yes. Did Jesus do this multiple times? Quite possible. So Matthew is taking an actual event that is familiar and real and using it as a basis to begin a selection on the parables of Jesus. What Jesus said on the actual day 13:1 was not unimportant, but to Matthew, not as important as the parables that follow. Now, if you look at the Gospel of John, you see it departs from the structure that you find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And in particular, the chronology of John's Gospel is different, and it raises questions for us. Was John writing chronologically or thematically? Why is there a difference here? But in particular, when you read the Gospel of John, you will notice that he does not use parables. Now, think of John chapter 6 as a good example of what I'm about to say. John chapter 6 is 71 verses, and it's a continuous narrative that is built around and based off of the feeding of the 5,000. What John has of Jesus' story are these long discourses. In the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we have these parables. Now, there are 3 general categories of parables, I would say to you. There are parables from everyday life, the sower. There are parables that are stories with comical elements, the pearl of the great price. And then there are parables that kind of fit in the middle. They are slices of real life, but there are twists that are comical within them that make them unreal. The one basic rule to know about parables is that you cannot draw up a set of rules that apply to all parables. There's no one formula that works to unpack them. The other thing is to remember that parables basically have one point to make, and that is it. Now, let's step back for a moment and look at the Protestant Reformation and how it saw the church. And I think this is extremely important in this day and age because we live in a time of transition and change. The Protestant Reformation did not happen in a vacuum, and it happened in a time of social and cultural reform, transition, and change. We could talk about the rise of modern Europe. We could talk about the invention of the printing press in the 1450s. What we have in this era of the Reformation is the rise of the middle class and the rise of literacy and eventually the rise of public education. Now, within that context, we understand why the reformers saw the preaching ministry as a key to understanding the nature of the church. We're not discounting the importance of preaching, but to say that when you look at the Reformation, that there was an overemphasis on the preaching aspect or the preaching role of the church. It's not so much right or wrong as a cultural thing. And so when we look at today's world, there are changes culturally and socially. One of the things that we have is that people are not going to listen to a 1 hour sermon today. Then at the same time, think of how there is a shift within most evangelical churches to where the worship part of the service is the music, not the whole service. And then we have to put this in the context that we live in an entertainment saturated age, and preaching will be seen from that perspective. The demise of preaching in the church is a problem because it's not so much that we can go back to how the reformers saw preaching, as much as preaching under the reformers became the primary way to teach the church. So why did you have 1 hour sermons? Because of the need to teach people. We need to rediscover the teaching element in the modern church, but we're not going to go back to the way the reformers did it. We have to find a way that works in a new era. The parables first and foremost teach us that the faith must be taught. No one can be a fully functioning disciple of Jesus without being taught and enduring and experiencing teaching. The parables tell us that the faith must be brought to bear on the world that the people of the church live in. The parables use the reality of everyday life to speak of what the faith is. The flip side of this would be that the people then can go back out into their everyday life and go, oh, this is what Jesus was talking about, because Jesus linked everyday life with the faith. The parables tell us that the great truths of the faith are ultimately practical truths. If we do not grasp what it means to receive mercy, we will not understand how we must extend mercy. If we do not understand the nature of free will, we will not see how people can reject the faith. The Christian faith will not go forth into our world and beyond unless we engage in a teaching ministry like Jesus did.